Hello everyone, and welcome to the Biblical Bookworm. My name is Elizabeth, and today we'll summarize the biblical series by Jordan Peterson. I'll give you a quick overview of this summary. It will consist of 3 parts. You're currently watching part 1. Here we'll summarize Jordan Peterson's ideas on the significance of the Bible, hints that something supernatural exists, the nature of God, and the nature of humans. Part 2 is going to be about mental health and his advice on how to be successful. In part 3, I'm going to summarize the main lessons from specific biblical stories. Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist, professor emeritus, and YouTube personality with currently more than 5 million subscribers. His videos on the psychological significance of the biblical stories are extremely popular on YouTube, with part 1 having more than 10 million views. In total, the biblical series is about 37 hours long, depending on what you count, which I will try to summarize in roughly 37 minutes in total in my 3 parts. First, Dr. Peterson explains why to bother at all about this strange book, the Bible. And he explains that it is worth to be investigated because it is a kind of mystery that the Bible outlived empires and kingdoms, and the fact that it motivated an entire culture for 2,000 years is also a serious phenomenon. Then he gives some general information about the Bible, like for example that it's not a scientific treatise, but the quote, lived experience of conscious individuals. Another thing that I found really interesting was that according to Dr. Peterson, the Bible presents variants of the same personality to find out what personality works in the world, starting with Adam and Eve, Abraham, Moses, and so on. And the personality that finally works in the world is Jesus. He explains that he made the observation that no matter how deep you go in the biblical stories, you're never at the bottom, as the deeper you dig, the more you find there. Dr. Peterson makes the remark that the Bible is the first hyperlinked book that has ever existed, with almost 65 cross-references. Of course, you can click on those hyperlinks, but here's a graphic that he also uses which illustrates these cross-references. The white and gray bars at the bottom represent different chapters in the Bible, starting with Genesis on the right, and the color of the arches indicates the distance between the 2 hyperlinked chapters. I will link the graphic in the description. Dr. Peterson objects the relatively common notion that the Bible was written as a sort of fairy tale for adults to make them feel comfortable. He says that the description of hell in the Bible doesn't fit the idea that the Bible was written to make people feel good. He also jokingly remarks that the Bible clearly wasn't edited by a committee that was concerned with not offending anyone. As a last introductory note, I'd like to mention that Dr. Peterson said at the beginning of the biblical series that as a rational person, he would try to explain everything with natural causes before starting to look for supernatural explanations, and he added that not everything will be explicable naturally. Now I'd like to summarize a bit what hints there are, according to Dr. Peterson, that something supernatural exists. He makes the statement that the evidence for religious experience is incontrovertible. He explains that it differs from a delusion, as a delusion is something that hardly anyone experiences, and things get worse if you act that delusion out. With religious experience, on the other hand, people oftentimes overcome addictions or in general take steps to improve their lives. Another topic Dr. Peterson talks about where he believes that there is more to it than appears on the surface, and that is dreaming. He is opposed to the idea that dreams are merely random neural firing, as according to him, there is nothing random about dreams as they are very complex and fully structured. Another property of dreams he discusses is that they can tell the dreamer information they didn't previously know, like for example, what is at the bottom of an argument with someone else, or people dream of past trauma that they need to process when awake, or they dream of the future and try to turn that dream into reality. Quote, where does the information that's in the dream come from? It has to come from somewhere. You could think of it as a revelation, because it's like it springs out of the void and it's new knowledge. You didn't produce it, it just appears. The dream happens to you just like life happens to you. Apart from that, Dr. Peterson also talks about the nature of God, especially the Trinity. He presents the audience with attributes of each of the 3 persons of the Holy Trinity, which I won't summarize. You can just look at the PowerPoint slides of part 1 of the biblical series. They are available on his website. What I'd like to touch upon is that Dr. Peterson said that God is an abstracted ideal. Quote, Here's a political implication. One of the debates, we might say, between early Christianity and the late Roman Empire was whether or not an emperor could be God. The Christian response to that was, never confuse a specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself. It's brilliant. You can't see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to a divine principle, for lack of a better word. At another point, he explains what the utility of abstraction is. And he explains that it's useful if you can abstract a common feature across a set of things, and what you have abstracted is more important than the differences among those things. What I found fascinating was when he talked about how a child playing with a doll is actually not imitating their mother, as it has never seen their mother play with a doll. That child has actually abstracted a characteristic of motherhood. And the last thing about the nature of God I'd like to mention is the fact that Jesus suffered and died, as he was God and human, embodies limitation. Let me explain that with a quote. And then there is the notion of the suffering individual. That's a very complicated idea. There's this idea that something with the attributes of God, omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, lacks something. The idea is limitation. Something that's everything lacks limitation. When I first encountered that, it just blew me away. It was such a brilliant realization that there are advantages to not being able to do things, partly because it gives you something to do. Dr. Peterson also talks about how the, quote, laws of our culture are predicated on the idea that there is an inherent value to every person, regardless of their abilities or transgressions. Another thing our legal systems are predicated on is that people are conscious as they are held accountable for their actions by the body of law. Part of the respect we pay to others is that we treat them like they are responsible for their actions, and people don't like it when they're being treated like they lack free will or are unconscious. Dr. Peterson explains that in the Old Testament, consciousness is associated with the divine, and so he concludes that our legal systems are based on the idea that there is something divine in humans. He says that it is not obvious how someone came up with the idea that there is intrinsic value in every individual, as people differ so much that it would have been more obvious to say that their value differs. He mentions Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, which shows what happens when people take the notion seriously that there is nothing inherently divine in humans. What I also found interesting was when Dr. Peterson talked about the time when he worked at a prison in his 20s, and he tried to figure out what the difference was between the inmates and him, so under what circumstances he would be capable of committing the crimes they had committed. And after about 2 weeks, he realized that there basically was no difference, and that committing those crimes himself would be much easier than he initially thought. Quote, "It's a very strange thing, because you wouldn't think that the revelation of the capacity of evil is a precondition for the realization of good. First of all, why would you be serious enough to even attempt to pursue the good unless you had some sense of what the consequence was of not doing it?" And that's actually something that I've read many times in the books I talk about on this channel, that you can't become a saint unless you realize that you're capable of committing every sin, and there is nothing about you that makes you a better person than someone who has already committed those sins. Here's another quote regarding that in the biblical series. "People don't refuse the ambition to become Hitler because they don't have the genocidal motivation. They don't follow that pathway because they don't have the organizational genius." That's been part 1 of my summary of the biblical series. Part 2 will follow next week. See you then, God bless, and bye!